On a cold January afternoon in 1999, Baltimore was shaken by a disappearance that would ignite one of the most controversial trials in American history. Hae Min Lee, a bright 18-year-old high school student, vanished without a trace after school. A month later, her body was discovered in a shallow grave in Leakin Park, and the hunt for her killer began. The city demanded justice. Police wanted answers fast, and soon, their focus turned towards someone shockingly close to Hae, her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. Adnan was only 17, a star athlete, an honor student, a son, a friend. Overnight, he was transformed from a promising teenager into the prime suspect in a murder case that would divide families, communities, and eventually, the entire world. But behind the headlines and courtroom drama, questions lingered. Was the case built on truth or on convenience? Did the system uncover justice or bury it beneath assumptions, biases, and silence? Before we dive into this chilling and unforgettable story, make sure to like and subscribe for more wrongful conviction investigations. Because Adnan's fight for freedom is not just a case in the past, it's a story still echoing in the present. This is Adnan Syed's story. It was Wednesday, January 13th, 1999, a day that began like any other for Woodlawn High School in Baltimore County, Maryland. The hallways buzzed with the chatter of students, lockers slamming, sneakers squeaking against linoleum floors. For many, it was just another day of classes, homework, and teenage drama. But for Hae Min Lee, an 18-year-old senior, full of life, ambition, and kindness, it was the last day anyone would ever see her alive. Hae was beloved. She played field hockey, managed the wrestling team, and dreamed of becoming an optician. Teachers praised her determination. Classmates admired her charisma. She balanced the responsibilities of a daughter, a student, and a friend with grace. That afternoon, Hae was supposed to pick up her younger cousin after school. She never arrived. At first, no one panicked. Maybe she had car trouble. Maybe she went to see a friend. But as hours passed, unease began to spread. Her family reported her missing that evening. The police began their standard questions. Who was the last person to see her? Where might she have gone? Did she have any enemies? The search for Hae consumed Baltimore's Korean-American community. Flyers with her smiling face went up in storefronts. Volunteers combed through neighborhoods. Parents kept their children close, afraid of what evil might be lurking in the city. But weeks dragged on without answers. Then, on February 9th, 1999, a man stumbled upon something horrific in Leakin Park, a wooded area notorious for hidden crimes. Half buried in a shallow grave was Hae Min Lee. The bright young woman whose future had once seemed limitless was gone, her life cut brutally short. The city grieved, but grief quickly turned into pressure. Pressure on detectives to deliver justice. Pressure to name a killer. The investigation tightened around those closest to Hae. The detectives wanted a narrative, a clean line from motive to crime. And for them, the story began with her recent breakup. Her ex-boyfriend, Adnan Syed. Adnan was just 17 at the time, a popular student, kind-hearted, a devout Muslim navigating the push and pull of teenage life and cultural expectations. Friends remembered him as funny, dependable, someone who didn't seem capable of violence. But police weren't looking for character references. They were looking for a suspect. To them, the pieces started falling into place. A young couple, broken up only weeks before. A girl who was moving on. A boy who might have been jealous, heartbroken, even angry. Detectives believed they had found their motive. Adnan couldn't let go. Soon, whispers turned into accusations. Rumors filled the hallways of Woodlawn High. Students debated behind lockers, torn between disbelief and suspicion. Could Adnan, the honors student who helped classmates with homework and drove friends to practice, really be capable of killing someone he once loved? Then came the breakthrough police were waiting for, or what they claimed was a breakthrough. A friend of Adnan's, Jay Wilds, came forward with a story. He told investigators that Adnan had confessed to strangling Hae, that he, Jay, had helped Adnan bury her body in Leakin Park. Jay's testimony became the backbone of the state's case. His words painted a chilling picture, a young man consumed by jealousy, snapping in a moment of rage. But even as he spoke, cracks showed. His timeline shifted. His details changed. Yet police pressed forward. They had their story, and they weren't letting it go. On February 28, 1999, Adnan Syed was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and robbery. In that moment, his life, once filled with dreams of college, family, and a future, shattered into fragments. For his parents, the arrest was devastating. Their son, whom they had raised with discipline and faith, was now paraded as a criminal. For the community, it was a moment of shock and disbelief. The boy they had known, the boy who stood tall in the mosque, was suddenly accused of the unthinkable. Behind bars, Adnan struggled to understand how quickly his world had collapsed. One day, he was a teenager worried about exams and prom. The next, he was wearing handcuffs, his name smeared across headlines. He maintained his innocence from the very first moment, but his words carried little weight against the tidal wave of suspicion. The narrative was too neat, too compelling for the public to ignore. A high school romance turned deadly. A jealous ex-boyfriend who couldn't accept rejection. To prosecutors, it was open and shut. To the media, it was sensational. To the world outside, Adnan was already guilty. But beneath the surface, questions bubbled. Why was there no physical evidence linking Adnan to the crime? Why did Jay's story shift every time he spoke? Why did the timeline feel like it was stitched together with guesswork and assumption? These questions wouldn't stop the gears of justice from turning. A trial date was set. The stage was prepared for one of the most contentious cases Baltimore would ever see. For Hae's family, grief was compounded by confusion. They had lost a daughter, a sister, a friend. Now, they were being told that the boy she once loved was the one who took her life. Their sorrow hardened into a quiet, aching pain that no verdict could truly heal. For Adnan, the nightmare was only beginning. Every moment inside the detention center felt like falling deeper into a hole with no rope, no light, no escape. He was not just fighting for freedom. He was fighting for his identity, his truth, his very existence. And yet, in those earliest days, when the accusations were fresh and the headlines were blazing, Adnan still believed that the truth would save him, that the system would see the holes in the case, that innocence would rise to the surface. He didn't yet know how wrong he was. The days following Hae Min Lee's disappearance bled into one another with a sickening weight. Baltimore County, a place already carrying the scars of urban struggle, now had a new wound. The missing posters clung to street lamps and grocery store doors, the ink already smudged from winter rain. Her friends at Woodlawn High carried her absence like a ghost in the hallways. Locker doors slammed, sneakers squeaked on linoleum floors, but everything felt muted, like the soundtrack of their teenage lives had been turned down. The teachers tried to carry on, but eyes darted constantly to Hae's empty seat in class. Her best friend wrote her notes in a spiral notebook, letters to someone who wasn't there, whispering, "Please, just walk in. Please, just come back." For weeks, there was hope. Hope that she had run away. Hope that she was hiding out somewhere. Hope that this nightmare would end with a phone call, or Hae herself walking back into Woodlawn with her bright laugh and the story of a wild detour. But hope has a cruel way of thinning with time. And then, in February of 1999, the truth came. Hae's body was discovered in Leakin Park, a patch of woods that locals whispered about, a place infamous for things that didn't want to be found. Strangled, buried in a shallow grave. The discovery shattered the fragile illusion that this was a simple disappearance. It was murder. The police shifted gears, from missing person posters to homicide boards. And with that shift came urgency and pressure. The city demanded answers. The family demanded justice. Adnan Syed was just 17 when the weight of suspicion began pressing down on him. On paper, he fit the narrative the detectives were building. He was Hae's ex-boyfriend, a teenager with heartbreak, jealousy, and, in the police's eyes, motive. In reality, he was just a kid, straddling two worlds. The son of devout Pakistani Muslim immigrants and a teenager trying to navigate American high school life. At first, Adnan didn't feel the net tightening. He grieved, like the others, shocked and numb. But then came the questions, pointed, insistent, loaded with implications. Where were you that afternoon? Did you try to see her after school? Did you fight? Adnan gave answers. They weren't enough. Memory is fragile, and on a cold January day weeks earlier, his was not a perfect timeline. His friends' recollections wavered, and the investigators didn't want wavering, they wanted certainty. And then came Jay Wilds. Jay, Adnan's acquaintance, not his closest friend, but someone in his orbit, gave police what they were looking for, a story. He claimed Adnan had strangled Hae, that Adnan had shown him her body, that he had helped bury her in Leakin Park. His account was inconsistent, shifting in detail each time he told it, but the skeleton of the story remained the same. And for the police, it was enough to set their sights squarely on Adnan. In late February, the handcuffs closed around Adnan Syed's wrists. The image was seared into the memory of every student at Woodlawn High, a young man they knew, who had walked their hallways, now being led away as a murderer. For Adnan's parents, it was an earthquake. His mother's voice cracked under the weight of disbelief, insisting her son was innocent. His father sat in stunned silence, a man crushed by something he could neither comprehend nor control. In their living room, the Quran sat open, pages fluttering as though even faith was trembling. Inside the jail cell, Adnan's world collapsed to concrete and steel. The clang of doors echoed against his thoughts. He replayed the moments with Hae, her laugh, her notes, their phone calls. And he could not reconcile the picture of the girl he once cared for with the horror of what had been done to her. Nor could he reconcile himself as the villain in this story. The media latched on, hungry for a narrative. A love story turned dark. A Muslim teenager whose cultural identity could be painted as controlling, jealous, possessive. Every headline seemed to cast him in shadows before he had even seen a courtroom. But beneath the frenzy, the questions were already starting to crack through. Why no fingerprints? Why no DNA? Why no murder weapon? Why no direct evidence? Nothing beyond the words of one young man whose story changed each time he told it. Still, the machinery of justice does not wait for certainty. It moves forward, slow and grinding, its wheels crushing anything in its path. For Hae's family, it was another wound. They mourned her loss, and in their grief, they clung to the hope of justice. If Adnan was guilty, they wanted accountability. If he wasn't, they could not see it yet. For them, the pain eclipsed doubt. For Adnan, each day in that cell was a countdown, not to freedom, but to trial. A trial where his life would hang in the balance. A boy behind bars, accused of a crime he insists he did not commit. A grieving family demanding closure. And a city bracing itself for a trial that would expose its fractures to the world. The stage was set. The prosecution was sharpening its case. The defense was scrambling, and the world, decades later, would still be asking the same haunting question. Did Adnan Syed kill Hae Min Lee? The courthouse in Towson stood like a fortress, tall, gray, and unforgiving. Its steps were worn down by years of people climbing them with lives hanging in the balance. In the winter of 2000, those steps carried the weight of an entire community, a family in grief, and a young man accused of a crime that would define the rest of his life. Inside, the atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation. The media vans parked outside hummed with generators, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters rehearsed lines, photographers polished their lenses. The headline had already been written: Teen kills ex-girlfriend. Now, the trial was the theater, and the city waited to see the curtain rise. Adnan Syed, just 18 years old, walked into that courtroom shackled not only by the chains on his wrists, but by the story already crafted about him. Dressed in a suit that hung a little too loosely on his thin frame, his dark eyes darted from face to face. He searched the jury box, wondering if anyone there could truly see him, or if they only saw the villain painted by police and prosecutors. For Hae Min Lee's family, every step into the courtroom was agony. Her mother sat silently, a tissue pressed to her lips, as if holding in a scream that had no place in this world. Her brother and cousins kept their heads low, avoiding the eyes of the boy they once saw walking with Hae in school hallways. To them, the trial was not about uncertainty, it was about closure. The prosecution wasted no time setting the scene. Their story was one of teenage jealousy turned deadly. They painted Adnan as a young man unable to handle rejection, a boy consumed by anger when Hae moved on. They leaned heavily on the testimony of Jay Wilds, the acquaintance who had come forward with the damning tale. Jay told the jury that Adnan had confided in him, that he had strangled Hae in a fit of rage, and that he, Jay, had helped bury her body in Leakin Park. His voice was steady as he spoke, but the cracks were there if one listened closely. His timeline shifted. The details changed. Sometimes the phone calls came before the murder, other times after. Sometimes he claimed to have seen Hae's body in the trunk at one place, then another. But the prosecution framed his inconsistencies as the natural slips of memory, the imperfections of truth-telling under stress. The jurors leaned in, listening. The idea of an accomplice, of a young man roped into a crime he hadn't committed but couldn't escape. It sounded plausible. And plausibility, in a courtroom, can sometimes weigh more than fact. Then came the cell phone records. The prosecution pointed to call logs, towers pinged near Leakin Park, patterns of communication that seemed to trace Adnan's movements on the day of Hae's disappearance. They framed the records as technological proof, cold, hard science that lined up with Jay's account. What they didn't tell the jury, what the defense failed to hammer hard enough, was that those very records came with disclaimers. Outgoing calls could be reliable, but incoming ones were not. And the tower pings were never meant to track precise location. The science was softer than it seemed. Adnan's attorney, Cristina Gutierrez, was once known as a fierce defender, but by the time she took his case, her health and career were unraveling. She cross-examined Jay, pointing out the contradictions, the holes in his story. But the delivery faltered. She came off as combative, scattered. The jurors' eyes glazed over. What might have been devastating points of doubt became lost in a haze of rapid-fire questions and a voice that cracked under strain. Adnan sat at the defense table, staring down at his notes. He had written out answers, details of his day, the fragments of memory that could prove he wasn't where the state said he was. He remembered a call to a friend, remembered being at the library, remembered the ordinary, mundane things of a January afternoon. But those memories never became the anchor of his defense. One girl could have changed everything: Asia McClain. She had written letters saying she had seen Adnan at the library at the very time the prosecution claimed Hae was being killed. But her testimony was never brought before the jury. She was left sitting outside the courtroom of history, her words sealed in envelopes instead of spoken into the record. As the days of testimony stacked up, the narrative hardened. The prosecution painted Adnan as manipulative, deceptive, capable of living a double life. To his friends, he was the golden boy, smart, charming, polite. But in their telling, beneath that veneer lay darkness. The suggestion was insidious. You think you know him, but you don't. For the jury, the emotional weight pressed hardest when the prosecution reminded them of Hae. Her smiling photographs were displayed, her diaries quoted. They read entries where she expressed frustration with Adnan, moments where she described moving on. The implication was clear. She was trying to break free, and he wouldn't let her go. In the gallery, Hae's mother wept. For her, this wasn't about inconsistencies or cell tower science. It was about her daughter, gone forever, and someone needing to pay for that loss. The courtroom became less about doubt and more about closure. The defense tried to remind the jury of what was missing. No fingerprints, no DNA, no murder weapon, no eyewitness. Nothing tied Adnan directly to Hae's death. Only the word of a man whose story shifted with the wind. But those reminders were whispers drowned out by the prosecution's thunder. Closing arguments were a study in contrasts. The prosecutor thundered about motive, about betrayal, about a boy who could not handle rejection. He spoke of cell records, of corroboration, of a witness who put himself at risk by telling the truth. He gestured toward Hae's family, their grief filling the room like smoke. Gutierrez, for the defense, argued that the state's case was paper-thin, that no one should be convicted on such fragile ground. But her words fell flat, tangled in her own faltering delivery. The jury retired to deliberate. Inside the jury room, 12 ordinary citizens sat with binders of notes, exhibits, and the image of 2 young lives. One ended, one accused of ending it. They pored over timelines, over testimonies. Some doubted Jay. Some wondered about the phone records. But in the end, the emotional weight bore down harder than the cracks in the case. After hours of deliberation, the verdict was reached. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Adnan's knees buckled as he absorbed it. His mother cried out, collapsing against her husband. His father lowered his head, whispering prayers that fell like stones into silence. Across the room, Hae's family wept too, but their grief was laced with a measure of closure. For them, the trial had delivered something final, even if nothing could truly heal the wound left behind. Adnan was sentenced to life in prison, plus 30 years. For a crime with no physical evidence, no forensic proof, and only the testimony of one inconsistent witness, the verdict was as heavy as iron. The courtroom emptied, but the story did not end there. For Adnan, prison walls became the borders of a new reality. For his family, each visit was a reminder of what had been stolen. For Hae's loved ones, the pain endured, even as they tried to believe justice had been served. And yet, for those who looked closer, doubt lingered like smoke after fire. Why had Asia McClain's letters been ignored? Why did Jay's story change so many times? Why were the cell records treated as gospel when their reliability was questionable? Why did the system move so quickly to condemn a teenager with no hard evidence? Justice, once delivered, is difficult to unravel. The verdict was written in ink, not pencil. But whispers of doubt had already begun, whispers that would grow louder over the years, until the world itself began to question whether the wrong boy had been locked away. The courtroom in Baltimore, 2000, was heavy with anticipation. For the family of Hae Min Lee, the trial promised answers, perhaps closure. For Adnan Syed, it was the moment everything would be decided. His youth, his freedom, his very future balanced on the edge of strangers' opinions. He was only 18, yet the stakes were life or death, freedom or a cage. From the start, the state painted a picture meant to linger in the jurors' minds. They described Adnan as a scorned ex-boyfriend who couldn't accept rejection, a young man consumed by jealousy and tradition. The prosecution insisted that Hae's murder was not random but deeply personal, fueled by Adnan's inability to let go. And to many in the courtroom, that story sounded convincing. After all, who among them hadn't heard of crimes of passion? But behind this neat narrative were cracks, gaps wide enough to swallow the truth. Prosecutor Kevin Urich stood before the jury, calm and deliberate. He outlined the state's timeline. On January 13, 1999, Adnan borrowed a friend's car and cell phone. He lured Hae away, strangled her, and left her body in Leakin Park. Later that night, he called on his friend Jay Wilds to help bury her. The state relied heavily on Jay, their star witness. Without him, there was little direct evidence tying Adnan to the crime. Jay's testimony was the spine of their case, but it was also riddled with inconsistencies. His timeline changed in almost every retelling, his memory shifting under pressure. Still, the prosecutors framed him as a reluctant accomplice. Jay has no reason to lie, Urich told the jury. He came forward because it was the right thing to do. The cell phone records became the prosecution's supporting actor. They showed calls bouncing off towers near Leakin Park. But what the jury never heard, and what would later come to light, was that the reliability of those records was deeply questionable. The cover page of the phone logs clearly stated they were not to be used for location accuracy in incoming calls. Yet that detail never reached the defense, never reached the jury. On the other side of the courtroom sat Cristina Gutierrez, Adnan's defense attorney. Once considered one of Baltimore's fiercest trial lawyers, she was known for her sharp tongue and dramatic courtroom presence. But by 2000, her health was in decline. She was sick, exhausted, and, as some later argued, no longer at the peak of her abilities. Gutierrez tried to poke holes in Jay's testimony. She highlighted the contradictions, the ever-changing details about where he was, what time events occurred, and how the burial unfolded. She questioned why the police seemed to feed Jay information rather than challenge him. But her defense missed key opportunities. The most glaring omission was Asia McLean's alibi. Asia, a classmate, had written letters to Adnan saying she saw him in the library at the very hour the state claimed the murder occurred. Her testimony could have created reasonable doubt. But Cristina Gutierrez never contacted her, never brought her to the stand. For reasons still debated, this vital alibi slipped through the cracks. And without it, the state's timeline stood unshaken. Trials are not only about evidence. They are about emotion, performance, and perception. And in that arena, the prosecution held the stage. Hae Min Lee's diary entries were read aloud, painting her as a teenage girl torn between love and independence. The state emphasized her words about feeling suffocated by Adnan's expectations, about wanting to move on. To the jury, it painted a motive, a young man desperate to control a girl who no longer wanted him. Every glance Adnan made, every gesture, was scrutinized. Was he too calm? Too detached? Did he show enough grief? Enough outrage? The jury didn't see a scared teenager fighting for his life. They saw a young man framed as a cunning killer. It didn't take long. On February 25, 2000, the jury delivered its verdict: guilty of first-degree murder, kidnapping, false imprisonment, and robbery. Adnan Syed was sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. The word struck like a hammer. His mother wept in the gallery. His friends sat in stunned silence. And Adnan, just 18 years old, was led away in shackles. The system had spoken. The story was sealed. At least, that's what everyone thought. For the Lee family, the verdict meant closure, or so they were told. But for Adnan's family, it meant devastation. His mother, Shamim, could hardly believe that the justice system had turned its back on her son. His father sat in silence, broken. Adnan himself, sitting in his cell that first night as a convicted murderer, could only replay the trial in his head. The moments Gutierrez didn't fight harder. The alibi that was never heard. The inconsistencies no one cared about. How, he wondered, could this be justice? Though the courtroom doors closed on Adnan that day, whispers of doubt lingered outside. Some classmates never believed the verdict. Journalists questioned the gaps in the state's case. And buried within the files, waiting for someone to notice, were pieces of evidence that didn't quite add up. It would take years, and a podcast listened to by millions, to reopen those doors. But for now, in 2000, Adnan Syed was another name lost in the prison system, a young man condemned to spend his life behind bars for a crime he swore he did not commit. When the gavel fell in that Baltimore courtroom in February 2000, Adnan Syed's world did not simply change, it collapsed. At just 18, his future was stripped away. Friends went off to college, started careers, fell in and out of love, and built lives. Adnan, instead, was led in chains through the steel gates of a Maryland prison, sentenced to die behind bars. The concrete walls greeted him with indifference. The clang of iron doors slammed out the last remnants of his teenage years. The boy who once ran cross-country, who went to prom, who laughed in high school hallways, was now an inmate identified by a number. His world had shrunk to a cell no larger than a walk-in closet. Yet inside, Adnan made a decision. If the system had taken his freedom, it would not take his spirit. Prison was a brutal equalizer. Violence could erupt without warning. Silence was currency. Trust was rare. For a teenager dropped into a world of hardened men, survival required adaptation. Adnan kept his head down. He prayed. He studied. He read everything he could get his hands on: philosophy, law, religion, literature. He filled notebooks with thoughts, reflections, and questions. Prison can either break you, he once said in a letter, or it can sharpen you. While others surrendered to despair, Adnan held tightly to discipline. He lifted weights in the yard. He memorized scripture. He built routines to preserve his sanity. And through it all, he clung to his innocence. Back home, his parents refused to abandon him. His mother, Shamim, visited as often as she could. She would sit across the plexiglass, tears in her eyes, whispering prayers into the phone receiver. "Beta," she told him, "you are not alone. God knows the truth." His father, quiet and stoic, carried the weight in silence. For immigrant parents who had come to America seeking opportunity, watching their son branded a murderer was a wound beyond words. Yet they fought for him in every way they could, writing letters, meeting with lawyers, praying endlessly. Their faith became his anchor. Outside those prison walls, Adnan's case faded into the background. Reporters moved on. The Lee family grieved privately. Files collected dust in courthouse storage. To most of Baltimore, the story was over. A young woman was dead, her ex-boyfriend convicted. Justice had been served. But justice is not always truth. And in Adnan's case, the truth still hid in the shadows. Over the years, small details began to surface. Adnan's appeals pointed to mistakes. The cell phone evidence was unreliable. His attorney had failed to call Asia McClain, The alibi witness who could place him in the library at the crucial hour. Jay Wilde's testimony, the backbone of the state's case, was filled with contradictions the jury never fully understood. Yet appeal after appeal was denied. Judges upheld the conviction. Doors closed. The system, once it decides, is slow to admit it might be wrong. By 2010, Adnan had been in prison for a decade. His youth was gone. His 20s stolen. His 30s slipping away. Still, he refused to give up. In 2013, a journalist and radio producer named Sarah Koenig stumbled across Adnan's case. A friend of his family, Rabia Chaudhry, had begged her to look deeper. Rabia believed the story had never been told fairly, that Adnan was innocent, that the system had failed him. Koenig wasn't sure, but she began to dig. She interviewed classmates. She combed through trial transcripts. She tracked down witnesses. She sifted through cell phone records. She even met with Jay, whose story still shifted in strange ways. What started as an investigation grew into something larger. In 2014, Sarah Koenig launched a podcast series called Serial. The first episode dropped on October 3rd, 2014. Within weeks, millions were listening. By the end of the year, it had become the most downloaded podcast in history. For listeners, Serial was not just a retelling. It was an invitation to question everything. Koenig's voice was measured, curious, never fully convinced one way or another. She laid out the prosecution's version, the defense's failings, and the inconsistencies that had haunted the case for years. People debated in classrooms, coffee shops, and workplaces. Did the state have enough evidence? Why hadn't the alibi witness been called? Could the cell phone records be trusted? The world was suddenly talking about a murder that had taken place 15 years earlier, as though it had happened yesterday. And at the center of it all was Adnan, calling in collect from a prison phone, his voice calm, steady, reflective. He didn't sound like a killer. He sounded like a man who had spent half his life behind bars still fighting to be heard. The impact was immediate. Legal organizations took notice. The Innocence Project began looking into the case. Journalists revisited old evidence. Asia McClain, long ignored, came forward again, her story unchanged. She had seen Adnan in the library that day. For Adnan, hearing his own story told to millions was surreal. He had once been forgotten, buried beneath headlines and court transcripts. Now, strangers across the world knew his name, his voice, his struggle. The walls of his prison cell remained, but the silence outside them had been shattered. As hope flickered back to life, Adnan reflected on the years he had lost. Friends who once laughed with him in the hallways of Woodlawn High were now raising children of their own. The world had moved into a digital age. Smartphones, social media, streaming, all foreign to a man locked away in 1999. Yet he remained centered in faith. He prayed. He forgave. He held no bitterness toward Hae, whose death he still mourned, nor toward her family, who believed he had killed her. What he wanted was simple, a chance to prove his innocence, a chance to live the years stolen from him. By 2016, the legal system could no longer ignore the noise. Judges agreed to hear new evidence. Asia McClain finally testified. Cell phone experts revealed how flawed the records truly were. For the first time in years, Adnan had a chance, however slim, at freedom. It was not certain. It was not easy. But it was something he had not felt in a very long time. Momentum. The long years of silence had given way to a movement. And for Adnan Syed, the prison gates no longer felt permanent. Still, every day behind bars was a reminder of how much had already been lost. 20 years of birthdays, family gatherings, friends' weddings, the small joys of life on the outside, walking through a park, choosing your own meals, driving with the windows down, all reduced to memory and imagination. Prison had aged him, but it had also forged him. And now, as the tide began to turn, Adnan faced the future with quiet resolve. He did not know if he would be free tomorrow, next year, or ever, but he knew the truth was finally being heard. The podcast ended, but the movement did not. Serial had cracked the silence open, and once people began questioning, they could not stop. Adnan's case had become a symbol, not just of one man's possible wrongful conviction, but of the flaws and fragility of the justice system itself. How many others, people asked, were sitting in prison cells, their voices unheard, their stories untold. For Adnan Syed, this was no longer just about survival. It was about reclaiming his life. And as the legal battles reignited, the possibility of freedom, once a distant dream, crept closer with every passing day. For more than 2 decades, Adnan Syed's world had been defined by confinement. The hum of fluorescent lights in cell blocks, the shuffle of prison shoes on concrete floors, the constant clang of steel doors closing. By the late 2010s, he had spent more time behind bars than he had ever lived in freedom. The world outside looked unrecognizable. Presidents had come and gone. Friends were now parents. Technology had leapt forward in ways Adnan could scarcely imagine. And yet, inside the walls of his prison, time was measured not by progress, but by hearings, appeals, and rulings. Each one carried hope. Each one risked heartbreak. In 2016, a Baltimore judge vacated Adnan's conviction, citing failures by his original attorney and weaknesses in the state's evidence. For a brief moment, the world held its breath. Was this it? Would Adnan finally walk free? But in 2019, the Maryland Court of Appeals reinstated his conviction, ruling 4-3 that while his attorney's mistakes were serious, they did not change the jury's decision. The swing of the legal pendulum was cruel. One day freedom seemed near, the next it was yanked away. Adnan returned to his cell, not broken, but exhausted. He had grown used to hope being dangled and then snatched away. Still, he refused despair. One day, he told those closest to him, "Truth will win." That day came in September 2022. After decades of legal battles, prosecutors in Baltimore reviewed his case again. This time, the examination was different. They uncovered evidence that had been buried for years. 2 alternate suspects who had been known to police at the time of the murder, but never disclosed to the defense. It was a revelation that shook the foundation of the case. How could such information be withheld? How could a jury have been asked to deliver justice when it had never been given the full story? The state moved to vacate his conviction. After 23 years behind bars, Adnan was granted release. On September 19, 2022, Adnan Syed walked out of prison. The world watched as cameras crowded the courthouse steps. He wore a white button-down shirt, glasses, and an expression of disbelief. After more than half his life spent in chains, he stood free under open sky. His mother, Shamim, wept openly, clutching his arm. His siblings surrounded him. Supporters cheered. Reporters shouted questions. But for Adnan, the noise faded into the background. He closed his eyes and breathed. For the first time in 23 years, the air was his to claim. It was a moment both triumphant and heartbreaking. Triumphant because he was finally free, heartbreaking because freedom had come after decades he could never reclaim. But freedom did not come with certainty. Prosecutors made clear they were still considering whether to retry him. For months, Adnan lived in a limbo few could understand. Technically free, but shadowed by the possibility of being dragged back into the system that had stolen so much from him. In March 2023, Maryland's appellate court briefly reinstated his conviction, citing procedural concerns with how the victim's family had been notified. Again, the pendulum swung. Again, Adnan's life hung in balance. But in October 2023, the Maryland Supreme Court agreed to hear his case, giving him a chance to make his freedom permanent. The battle was not over, but the tide had shifted. Even as hope burned brighter than ever, the cost was undeniable. Adnan Syed had entered prison as a teenager. He emerged a man in his 40s. Entire decades of his life, the carefree years of young adulthood, the milestones of growing older, the chance to start a family, had been erased. His parents had aged while he was gone. Friends had built lives he could only glimpse from the distance of phone calls and visiting rooms. And through it all, one truth remained unbearable. No one could give him back the time he had lost. Adnan's case is more than a single story of injustice. It is a mirror reflecting the cracks in America's justice system. Evidence withheld, inconsistent testimony, a defense that failed to investigate critical leads, a jury asked to decide guilt without the full truth. If this could happen to a teenager from Baltimore, it could happen to anyone. And Adnan is not alone. Across the United States, thousands remain imprisoned for crimes they did not commit. Some will be proven innocent. Many never will. For Adnan, freedom was never just about himself. He has spoken about the importance of shining a light on wrongful convictions everywhere, on reminding the public that the system is not infallible. His case, amplified by serial and carried forward by tireless advocates, has become a rallying cry. It has shown the power of journalism, persistence, and truth, and the devastating consequences when justice fails. As of today, Adnan Syed walks free, but the scars remain. The years lost can never be returned. The trauma cannot be erased. And yet, he is still here, still standing, still speaking. A symbol not just of survival, but of the resilience of the human spirit and of the urgent need for a justice system that values truth above conviction rates. Adnan Syed's story forces us to confront a painful reality. Justice in America is not always just. For every Adnan, there are countless others, men and women whose voices have not yet reached our ears, whose freedom still hangs in silence. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe to Innocence Uncovered for more stories of wrongful convictions, exonerations, and the fight for truth. Share this video, because raising awareness is the first step toward reform. And if you want to learn more or support the fight against wrongful convictions, visit Innocence Project, Maryland Innocence Project. Because Adnan Syed's case is not just history, it's a warning. And together, we can make sure stories like his are not repeated. This was the story of Adnan Syed.